At a busy airport gate, Agent Kyle Preston tears an elderly black woman's boarding pass in half, accusing her of using a fake ticket, humiliating her in front of a full terminal of waiting passengers. Rewind plus emotional backstory. We go back to the previous morning at Verna Coleman's small home, revealing she raised her son alone after his father left, sacrificing everything to support his dream of becoming a pilot, and she still carries his childhood toy airplane in her purse. Rich/public setting build. The airport terminal is introduced in cinematic detail. A modern hub with a VIP lounge, business travelers, uniformed crews, and the social hierarchy of who gets treated well and who doesn't. First, humiliation layer. Verna is questioned harshly about her ticket's validity despite it being a genuine companion pass, mocked for her worn suitcase and modest clothing, while other passengers are waved through. Repeated injustice/system pattern. Flashback beats reveal Kyle has a pattern of profiling and mistreating older, working-class, and minority passengers at this gate for months, with complaints quietly dismissed by management. Second, good character/silent witness. A gate supervisor named Renee, who has quietly documented Kyle's behavior, tries to intervene and hints that this has happened before to people who couldn't fight back. Villain crosses the line. Kyle tears Verna's boarding pass in half and calls airport security to have her removed, insisting she's committing fraud despite her calm insistence that the ticket is real. Hidden proof/evidence stacking. We learn Verna's companion pass was issued by the airline specifically because her son is a captain with the company, and that Renee has already alerted the crew scheduling office to the unfolding situation. Authority entry/power walk. The flight's captain, having heard about a passenger being removed at his gate, walks off the jet bridge in full uniform, and the terminal falls silent as he approaches. Big reveal plus proof scene. The captain calls Verna Mom in front of the stunned terminal, revealing she raised him alone and inspired his career, backed by his employee ID, her authentic companion pass records, and crew scheduling confirmation. Villain collapse plus justice. Kyle's excuses collapse as airline management arrives. His history of complaints is exposed, and he faces termination and formal investigation in front of the very passengers he mistreated. Aftermath plus emotional ending plus CTA. Months later, Verna flies proudly as her son's honored guest. The airline reforms its companion pass verification training. Renee is promoted, and the story closes with an emotional message and YouTube call to action. "This ticket is fake, ma'am. Did you really think we wouldn't notice?" The words rang out across the crowded gate area, sharp enough that dozens of heads turned at once. Kyle Preston, the airline's gate agent, stood behind the counter holding two torn halves of a boarding pass, a satisfied smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, as if he'd just caught something clever. Verna Coleman stood across from him, 71 years old, wearing a simple floral blouse and carrying a well-worn suitcase held together with a faded luggage strap. She did not raise her voice. She did not reach for the torn paper in his hands, though something in her eyes flickered with quiet disbelief at what he had just done. "That was a valid pass," she said softly. "My son works for this airline. That ticket was issued to me directly by crew scheduling." A few passengers nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances, unwilling to intervene, unwilling to be the one who said something to a man in a company uniform standing behind an official counter. Somewhere near the back of the line, a businessman checked his watch, more concerned about his own departure time than the scene unfolding a few feet away. "Ma'am, I've worked this gate for 6 years," Kyle said, louder now, clearly performing for the gathering crowd. "I know a real companion pass when I see one, and this isn't it. You'll need to step aside so I can help paying customers." Verna reached instinctively into her purse, her fingers brushing against a small, worn toy airplane she had carried for over 2 decades, and took a slow breath before speaking again. "I just need to get to my son," she said quietly. "That's all I'm asking." Kyle laughed, tossing the torn halves of her boarding pass onto the counter like they were nothing. "Then I suggest you call him and ask him to buy you a real ticket next time." They had no idea who was about to walk off that jet bridge in less than 10 minutes, or how completely this moment was about to unravel in front of everyone watching. The morning before, in a small brick house on a quiet street 2 hours outside the city. Verna Coleman had woken before sunrise, just as she had for most of her adult life. She made coffee in the same chipped mug she'd used for 30 years, sat at her kitchen table, and looked, as she often did before a trip, at the photograph taped inside the cabinet door. Her son Daniel, maybe 8 years old in the picture, grinning behind the controls of a small toy cockpit she'd built for him out of a cardboard box and an old steering wheel from a yard sale. Daniel's father had left when the boy was 6, leaving Verna to raise him alone on a school cafeteria worker's wage, stretching every dollar to keep food on the table and, more importantly to her, to keep Daniel's dream alive. He had been obsessed with airplanes since before he could properly speak the word, tracking flight paths in the sky from their small backyard, saving every dollar of his allowance toward a single flight lesson he finally took at 16, thanks to Verna quietly working a second job for 8 months without ever telling him why. She had sold her wedding ring to help cover his first year of flight school. She had driven 3 hours each way, twice a month, just to sit in the audience during his training milestones, clapping louder than anyone else in the room. When Daniel was finally hired as a first officer years later, he had given her a small toy airplane, the same model as the cardboard cockpit she'd built him as a child, and told her, through tears neither of them tried to hide, "Everything I have because you never once let me stop believing." She kept a small notebook in her bedside drawer too, filled with newspaper clippings about aviation programs and scholarship deadlines she had researched years earlier, back when she was quietly trying to find every possible avenue to help Daniel afford flight school without ever letting him see how tight things really were at home. She never wanted him to carry the weight of her sacrifices. She only wanted him to fly. Today, she was flying to see him complete his very first flight as captain, using the companion travel pass the airline had issued specifically for family members of its pilots. She had checked the paperwork twice the night before, tucking the boarding pass carefully into her purse beside Daniel's old toy airplane, too excited to sleep much at all. She had no idea, locking her front door that morning, that in a matter of hours, a stranger behind an airport counter would tear that boarding pass in half in front of a room full of people. The terminal that morning buzzed with the particular energy of a major international hub during peak travel season. Glass windows stretched floor to ceiling, framing a view of aircraft taxiing beneath a pale morning sky. A gleaming VIP lounge sat just beyond the security checkpoint, visible through frosted glass doors, reserved for business-class travelers and elite frequent flyers who moved through the terminal with the practiced ease of people who had never once been questioned about whether they belonged. Uniformed flight crews walked briskly between gates, rolling suitcases clicking rhythmically against polished floors. Gate agents in crisp company blazers checked boarding passes with quick, efficient scans, waving through travelers in business suits with barely a second glance, while occasionally scrutinizing others more closely, a pattern so subtle most passengers never noticed it at all. Gate 14, where Verna Coleman now stood, sat directly across from a bank of windows overlooking the jet bridge for the morning flight to the coast, the very flight her son Daniel was scheduled to captain for the first time. The gate area had filled steadily over the past hour, a mixture of business travelers checking emails on their phones, families managing restless children, and a handful of airline employees traveling on standby passes, easily identifiable by their company badges. It was a setting built entirely around quiet hierarchies, who got acknowledged first, who got the benefit of the doubt, who got waved through without question, and who, like Verna, got stopped and scrutinized simply for not looking the way the system expected a paying passenger to look. She had no idea, standing quietly in line with her worn suitcase and her carefully checked boarding pass, how much that quiet hierarchy was about to be shattered in front of everyone watching. The trouble had started the moment Verna reached the front of the line and handed over her boarding pass. Kyle Preston had glanced at it for less than 2 seconds before his expression shifted into something skeptical. "This is a companion pass," he said, turning the paper over as if searching for a flaw. "These get misused a lot. You'll need to show me some additional verification." "Of course," Verna said, reaching calmly into her purse and producing her identification along with a printed confirmation email from the airline's crew scheduling office. My son works for the airline. He's the captain on this flight. Kyle barely looked at the documents. Ma'am, everybody who tries to use a fake companion pass has a story like that. It's not a story, Verna said, her voice still gentle but firmer now. It's the truth. You're welcome to call scheduling and confirm it. I don't have time to call every passenger's family member to verify a story, Kyle snapped, loud enough that several nearby travelers glanced over. He looked her up and down, taking in her worn suitcase, her modest floral blouse, her careful, unhurried manner, and something in his expression hardened into judgment. Behind Verna, a businessman in a tailored suit stepped up with a first-class ticket, and Kyle's entire demeanor shifted instantly, his voice warming into practiced courtesy. Right this way, sir. We'll get you boarded first. Verna stood quietly aside, watching the stark difference in treatment play out in real time, saying nothing, though something in her posture, a lifetime of swallowing indignities quietly to avoid making a bigger scene, settled heavily over her shoulders. What Kyle didn't notice, distracted by his own performance of authority, was that a gate supervisor named Renee, standing near the podium reviewing the flight manifest, had gone very still, watching the entire exchange with an expression that wasn't confusion at all. It was familiarity. That small detail, a supervisor's quiet stillness near the gate podium, would become the first crack in Kyle Preston's entire morning. This was not the first time Kyle Preston had treated a passenger this way, and it would not have been the last had the right person not happened to be flying that very flight. 4 months earlier, an elderly Vietnamese man traveling with his granddaughter had been held at this same gate for nearly 20 minutes while Kyle insisted his valid senior discount fare looked suspicious, ultimately causing the man to miss his boarding window entirely and requiring a rebooking that cost him an additional $200 in fees. 2 months before that, a young black flight attendant traveling a standby pass to reach a family emergency had been publicly questioned about whether her employee badge was actually hers, delaying her boarding long enough that she missed the flight and arrived at her grandmother's hospital bedside 4 hours later than she otherwise would have. And just 6 weeks ago, a woman using a wheelchair had been told by Kyle that her pre-boarding request seemed unnecessary, given how easily she had walked to the counter, a comment that left her in tears in front of a gate full of waiting passengers. Each of these passengers had left Gate 14 believing the fault must somehow be their own, that they had misunderstood a policy, worn the wrong thing, or simply asked their question the wrong way. None of them knew that the same agent, working the same gate, had made a habit of deciding, at a glance, exactly who deserved patience and who did not. Renee had documented each of these incidents in careful, dated notes kept in a small notebook in her office desk, having filed 2 formal complaints with regional management over the past year, both of which had been quietly closed without any disciplinary action noted in Kyle's personnel file. A gate doesn't announce when one of its agents has developed a pattern of quiet cruelty. It simply keeps operating quietly until someone with enough standing finally happens to be present to make the pattern impossible to ignore any longer. Verna Coleman, standing calmly at the counter with her torn boarding pass, now resting uselessly in Kyle's hand, was about to become exactly that kind of moment. Renee Whitfield had worked as a gate supervisor for this airline for 9 years. She had learned carefully exactly how far she could push back against a difficult employee before management simply closed her complaints and moved on, and exactly how much quiet advocacy she could offer passengers within those narrow limits. But watching Verna Coleman stand there, dignified and calm despite Kyle's escalating rudeness, something in Renee finally reached its breaking point. She stepped away from the podium and approached the counter directly. "Kyle, let me see that pass," she said, holding out her hand. "It's a fake, Renee," Kyle said dismissively. "I've got a line to move. I'll be the judge of that," Renee said, taking the torn halves and turning them over carefully. Her stomach dropped as she recognized the formatting immediately. A genuine companion travel authorization, issued directly through crew scheduling, exactly matching the format she reviewed dozens of times a month for airline employees' family members. She looked up at Verna. Ma'am, may I ask who your son is? Daniel Coleman, Verna said quietly. He's the captain on this flight. Renee's breath caught. She had reviewed the crew manifest less than an hour earlier. She knew exactly who Daniel Coleman was, and she knew, with growing dread, exactly what was about to happen if this situation wasn't handled immediately. Ma'am, I need you to wait right here, she said, already reaching for a radio. Then she turned to Kyle, her voice dropping low enough that only he could hear. I tried reporting you before. Twice. Nobody listened. But you need to understand something. This is not the first time you've done this, and this time, the person you just humiliated has a connection to this flight that you cannot begin to imagine. She didn't know it yet, but in less than 10 minutes, Daniel Coleman himself was going to walk off that jet bridge, and her decade of quietly documented patience was finally about to matter. Kyle, misreading Renee's tension as simple procedural caution rather than genuine alarm, doubled down instead of backing away. This is exactly why we have policies, he said loudly, turning back to Verna with renewed confidence now that a supervisor had, in his mind, simply confirmed his suspicion by getting involved. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the boarding line. I'm calling airport security to have this pass investigated for fraud. Kyle, wait, Renee started, but he had already picked up the gate phone, requesting security assistance in a voice loud enough to carry across the entire waiting area. Verna stood perfectly still, her composure remarkable given the circumstances, though her hand had found Daniel's small toy airplane in her purse once more. Holding it the way people hold something solid when the ground beneath them suddenly feels uncertain. Sir, I promise you, if you would simply call crew scheduling, she tried once more. Ma'am, please step aside, Kyle said, his voice hardening further, clearly enjoying the authority the moment gave him in front of the gathering crowd. I don't have time to entertain every story a passenger invents when they get caught. 2 uniformed security officers arrived within minutes, drawn by Kyle's urgent call, and the entire gate area went quiet with anticipation. Dozens of passengers now openly watching the unfolding scene, phones beginning to rise as people quietly started recording. But Kyle had no idea that Renee had already radioed ahead to crew scheduling, confirming Verna's identity and relationship to the flight's captain in real time. He had no idea that the call, in every sense that mattered, had already been made, and that it was about to reach someone with far more authority than airport security. What Kyle Preston did not know, what almost no one in that gate area knew, was that Renee's radio call to crew scheduling had been overheard by the flight's first officer, standing just inside the jet bridge door, completing pre-flight paperwork alongside Captain Daniel Coleman. Daniel had heard his mother's name mentioned over the radio traffic and felt his stomach drop immediately. He knew Verna was flying that morning as his guest. He knew, instantly, that something had gone wrong. Crew scheduling, alerted by Renee's urgent confirmation request, pulled Verna's companion pass authorization within 90 seconds, verifying every detail exactly as Renee had described. A legitimate, fully authorized travel benefit issued directly to Daniel Coleman's listed family member, processed through the airline's official employee travel system 3 weeks earlier. The dispatcher on duty, recognizing the seriousness of a captain's family member being accused of fraud and detained by security at his own departure gate, immediately flagged the situation to the base's regional operations manager, who happened to be reviewing morning departure from an office just 2 floors above the terminal. Within minutes, 3 separate confirmations had stacked up. Renee's visual verification of the pass format, crew scheduling's official database record, and the regional operations manager's direct authorization confirming Verna Coleman's status as an approved travel companion. None of this had reached Kyle yet. He stood at his counter, arms crossed, satisfied with his own authority, watching security approach Verna with the same confident certainty he'd carried through every similar incident over the past several months. None of this had reached Kyle yet. He stood at his counter, arms crossed, satisfied with his own authority, watching security approach Verna with the same confident certainty he'd carried through every similar incident over the past several months. He had no reason yet to believe this morning would be any different from the dozen other times he had made a similar call and walked away from it without consequence. He had no idea that the son he'd humiliated a stranger's mother in front of an entire terminal for was, at that very moment, already stepping through the jet bridge door. The jet bridge door opened with a soft mechanical hiss that, on any other morning, no one at Gate 14 would have noticed at all. This time, every head turned. A tall man in a crisp captain's uniform, for gold stripes gleaming on each shoulder, walked briskly into the gate area, his expression tight with barely controlled urgency. Renee straightened immediately, relief washing visibly across her face. Kyle's confident posture faltered slightly as he registered the uniform, the stripes, the unmistakable authority the man carried without needing to raise his voice at all. "What is happening here?" Captain Daniel Coleman asked, his eyes scanning the scene quickly before landing on the two security officers standing near his mother. "Sir, we're investigating a possible fraudulent boarding pass," one of the officers said, gesturing toward Verna. Daniel's eyes moved to his mother, standing quietly beside the counter, her torn boarding pass still clutched in Kyle's other hand, her composure intact, but her eyes glistening with an emotion the whole terminal was about to understand. The gate area fell into a silence so complete that the soft hum of the terminal's ventilation system suddenly seemed loud. Daniel crossed the remaining distance in a few quick strides, his voice breaking slightly as he reached his mother. "Mom," he said, wrapping his arms around her without a moment's hesitation. "Are you okay? What happened?" Kyle's face drained of color so quickly that Renee actually stepped forward, as though worried he might need to sit down. The torn boarding pass slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the polished floor between them. The word "Mom," spoken in a captain's uniform in front of an entire terminal of stunned witnesses, landed like a verdict no one needed further evidence to understand. "I'm all right, baby," Verna said softly, her hand resting against her son's chest the way it had 1,000 times over the years, though her voice trembled slightly now that the tension of the last 20 minutes had finally caught up to her. "This young man tore up my ticket, said it wasn't real." Daniel turned slowly, his expression hardening into something far colder than the warmth he'd shown his mother seconds earlier. "You tore up her boarding pass?" "Sir, Kyle stammered, all his earlier confidence completely gone. "I didn't know she was your mother." The pass was real," Renee said firmly, stepping forward with the torn halves now in her own hands. "I confirmed it with crew scheduling myself. This is a properly authorized companion pass, issued 3 weeks ago, exactly as Mrs. Coleman told you the first time she explained it. I was just following procedure," Kyle said, his voice rising in pitch, desperation creeping in. "Procedure doesn't include tearing a paying passenger's documentation in half in front of a crowded gate," the regional operations manager said, arriving at that exact moment with a tablet displaying the crew scheduling authorization on screen for everyone to see. "Nor does it include calling security on a woman who calmly offered you identification, a confirmation email, and her son's name as a captain with this airline, all of which you dismissed without a single verification call." Daniel looked at Kyle directly, his voice quiet but carrying the full weight of everything that had just happened. "My mother sold her wedding ring to pay for my first year of flight school. She worked a second job for 8 months so I could take my first lesson. Everything I have in this uniform exists because of the woman you just told to step aside like she didn't belong here." The gathered crowd, many of them still recording on their phones, watched in complete silence as Kyle Preston's excuses visibly crumbled in real time, each one collapsing under the weight of a truth the entire terminal had just witnessed with their own eyes. The regional operations manager did not wait for a private conversation to address what had happened. "Mr. Preston, I'm suspending you effective immediately, pending a full investigation," she said, her voice calm but final, carrying easily across the silent gate area. "This is not the first complaint filed against you regarding passenger treatment. It will, however, likely be the last." Kyle's face had gone the color of the terminal's pale floor tiles. His hands trembled slightly as he removed his company badge, setting it on the counter without being asked, the gesture of a man who understood, finally, that there was no talking his way out of what dozens of people had just witnessed. "I didn't mean," he started, but the words died in his throat, unable to find an ending that made any sense given what had just happened. A few of the passengers who had watched silently earlier, unwilling to intervene, now stepped forward to offer Verna kind words, several of them apologizing for not speaking up sooner. One young woman gently picked up the torn halves of Verna's boarding pass from the floor and handed them back to her, saying quietly, "You deserve so much better than this." An older gentleman near the front of the line, who had watched the entire exchange without saying a word, approached Renee quietly and admitted that he'd witnessed Kyle treat another elderly passenger poorly months earlier, but had never thought it was his place to report it. "I should have said something then," he said. "Maybe this wouldn't have happened again." Renee helped process an immediate replacement pass, escorting Verna personally toward priority boarding while Daniel remained a moment longer, speaking quietly but firmly with the operations manager about the pattern of complaints Renee had documented over the past year, complaints that would now, finally, receive the full review they had always deserved. Justice, in that gate area, didn't arrive as shouting or spectacle. It arrived quietly, inevitably, in the shape of a system finally forced to look directly at what it had been ignoring for months. 6 months later, Verna Coleman stood at the same airport, though this time she walked through security with a permanent, formally issued travel credential bearing her photograph and her son's employee number, a small laminated reminder that she would never again need to prove she belonged somewhere she already had every right to be. The airline's internal investigation into Kyle Preston's conduct concluded with his termination, along with a broader review that uncovered 11 separate documented incidents involving passenger mistreatment over the preceding year, several of which echoed uncomfortable patterns along lines of age, race, and visible disability. Renee Whitfield, whose years of quiet documentation had finally been taken seriously, was promoted to Regional Customer Experience Manager, a newly created position tasked with overhauling gate agent training around passenger dignity, unconscious bias, and proper verification procedures for companion travel passes. The airline publicly apologized to Verna Coleman and, at her request, redirected part of its settlement offer toward a scholarship fund supporting aspiring pilots from working-class families. Young people, the fund's charter stated, who might not otherwise have the resources Daniel once needed to make his own dream take flight. Daniel Coleman continued flying as captain, and Verna now travels with him several times a year, sitting proudly in the cabin during moments the airline schedules specifically to honor family members of its flight crews. She still carries his small toy airplane in her purse on every trip, though now it sits beside a laminated travel credential that no one has ever questioned again. "That torn boarding pass," Verna said once, in a brief interview that circulated widely after the story became public, "could have been the end of a very hard day. Instead, it turned out to be the moment somebody finally saw me the way my son always has." Have you ever watched someone dismiss another person simply because they didn't look like they belonged? What would you have done in that gate area? Drop your answer in the comments below. Like, share, and subscribe for more real stories about dignity, justice, and the quiet power of people who are underestimated.